So I bet some of you are playing hooky tonight from a rehearsal or a practice or a lesson. Is that true for anyone here? Not your own, of course, but your kids. But I want to start with another question. How many of you were in the National Honor Society in high school? What about in middle school? A few hands. Anyone in elementary school? Oh, well, we got one hand here. Well, that was a trick question because the National Elementary Honor Society actually was established in 2008. And it's really indicative of the downward pressure for academic and extracurricular success in American childhood today. And where we are sitting tonight, Atia Middle School has a National Junior Honor Society chapter, and parents, anyone who's a parent here, they're currently accepting applications according to their website, so you might want to talk to your kids. But according to their website, the National Junior Honor Society candidates here are required to participate in a total of 4 extracurricular activities and complete 4 hours of service. Applicants must participate in a minimum of 3 categories: service, clubs, sports, or other miscellaneous activities. So included in that list are any travel sports, show choir, plays, etc. So how many of you have kids who would fit into that requirement there, a total of 4 extracurricular activities? Yep, seeing a lot of hands. Not all of those activities, of course, involve competition, but many of them do. So tonight we're going to talk about competitive activities for kids, activities where they've had to try out, so probably instances where your kids have faced rejection perhaps, and perhaps cases where you've disagreed with a teacher or coach and how you can handle that. We're going to put all of these questions into context. How did we get here? How did we evolve as American society and as parents to be in these situations? And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of why these activities matter, the kinds of questions you should ask before getting involved with your kids, and how to decide what works best for your family. So my own research is drawn from years of fieldwork and interviews with parents, elementary school-age children, and teachers and coaches. And these focuses have been in activities for me like chess, dance, soccer, after-school math classes, and yes, even child beauty pageants. So I argue that the extensive time devoted to competition is driven by parents' demand for credentials for their children, which they see as a necessary and often sufficient condition for entry into the upper middle class and the good life that accompanies it. It seems that as the parental second shift continues to grow, alongside it, a second shift for children has emerged, which is suffused with competition rather than mere participation. I developed the concept of competitive kid capital to explore the ways in which winning has become central to the lives of many American children. I look at young children, showing how this race to the top starts earlier than ever. So American children not only participate in myriad after-school activities, they also compete. In 2013, 7.7 million children played on a high school sports team. At the same time, U.S. Youth Soccer, just one sport activity, the national organization that oversees travel soccer, registers more than 3 million children between the ages of 5 and 19 who play at a competitive level. And that's not taking into account the thousands of children who play recreationally each year. Middle and upper middle class kids routinely try out for pay-to-play all-star teams, travel to regional and national tournaments, and clear off bookshelves to hold all of those trophies that they've won or been given just for participating. But it's not always been this way. About 100 years ago, it would have been lower class children competing under non-parental adult supervision while their upper class counterparts participated in non-competitive activities like dancing and music lessons, often in the family home. Children's tournaments, especially athletic ones, came first to poor children, often immigrants living in big cities. It wasn't until after World War II that these competitive endeavors began to be dominated by children from the middle and upper middle classes. So how did this transformation happen? Well, things first began to change in the 19th century with the start of the mandatory schooling movement. Massachusetts was the first to make schooling compulsory in 1852, though it wasn't until 1917 that the final state, Mississippi, passed a similar law. Here in Illinois, that happened in 1883. With the institution of mandatory schooling, children experienced a profound shift in the structure of their daily lives, especially in the social organization of their time. Compulsory education brought leisure time into focus. Since school time was delineated as obligatory, free time could now be identified as well. But what do you do with this free time? That question was on the minds of parents, social workers, and quote-unquote experts who doled out advice on child rearing. Now, the answer lay partly in competitive sports leagues, which started to evolve to hold the interest of children. Urban reformers were particularly preoccupied with poor immigrant boys who, because of overcrowding in tenements, were often out on the streets. Initial efforts focused on the establishment of parks and playgrounds, and powerful, organized playground movements developed in New York City and Boston. But because adults didn't trust boys in particular to play unsupervised, attention soon shifted to organized sports. And sports in particular were seen as important in teaching the quote-unquote American values of cooperation, hard work, and respect for authority. So in 1903, New York City's Public School Athletic League for Boys was established, and by 1910, other cities across the US had formed their own competitive athletic leagues. Settlement houses and ethnic clubs soon followed suit, and the number of these boys' clubs grew rapidly through the 1920s, working often in parallel with school leagues. But during the Depression, many of those clubs with competitive leagues suffered financially and had to close. So poorer children from urban areas began to lose opportunities for competitive athletic contests organized by adults. Fee-based groups, such as the YMCA, began to fill the void, but usually only middle-class kids could afford to participate. At roughly the same historical moment, athletic organizations were founded that would soon formally institute national competitive tournaments for young kids, of course, for a price. For example, national pay-to-play organizations like Pop Warner Football came into being in 1929. At the same time, many physical education professionals stopped supporting athletic competition for young children because of worries that leagues supported competition only for the best athletes, leaving the others behind. So concerns about focusing on only the most talented athletes developed into questions about the harmfulness of competition. Sound familiar? In the end, this meant that much of the organized youth competition left to the school system, and even to this day for elementary school kids. But it did not leave American childhood. One of the first children's activities to become nationally organized in a competitive way, and certainly one of the most well-known and successful youth programs in general, is Little League Baseball. After its creation in 1939, the league held its first World Series only a decade later in 1949. In the ensuing years, Little League experienced a big expansion in the number of participants. Just a decade later, in 1959, Little League sponsored 5,000 leagues, each with multiple team rosters organizing 15 to 20 young boys. As this model of children's membership in a national league organization developed, fees to play and compete only increased. With the success of these fee-based national programs, it became more difficult to sustain free programs. Most elementary schools no longer sponsored their own leagues due to concerns over the effects of competition on children, similar to concerns voiced in the 1930s. The desire to dampen overt competition in school classrooms was part of the self-esteem movement that started in the 1960s. Now, the self-esteem movement focused on building up children's confidence and talents without being negative or comparing them to others. As the movement didn't reach outside activities like sports, private organizations developed and rushed to fill the void. Parents increasingly wanted more competitive opportunities for their children and were willing to pay for it. So by the 1960s, parents and kids spent time together at practices for sports that were part of an actual national structure. So there was Biddy basketball, Pee Wee hockey, and Pop Warner football, in addition to Little League. Even non-team sports were growing and developing their own formal national level organizations run by adults. For example, double Dutch jump roping started on playgrounds in the 1930s. Some of you might have done it growing up. But in 1975, the American Double Dutch League was formed to set formal rules and sponsor competitions. More aware of the stakes, families became more competitive, and even more competitive after-school activities for kids continued to develop, evolve, and intensify, particularly in the 1990s. For example, in 1995, the Amateur Athletic Union, known to many kids as the AAU, sponsored about 100 national championships for youth athletes. About a decade later, that number had grown to over 250, thanks to an expansion of both athletic offerings, so offering more sports, and a lowering of age levels. So it used to be you could have 10-year-old national champions. Now they started as young as 6. I call this trend the carving up of honor. And this brings us to the present day. Just so we all agree on what a competitive activity is, though, when I say a competitive activity, I mean organized activities run by adults where records are kept and prizes are given out. Now, of course, we have a continuum of competition in childhood and in life, but in childhood this could include sandbox play to the left, playing on a sandlot, games kids organize themselves. The activities that I've studied are right of center for sure, but they're not at the extreme elite level. In fact, in all of the activities I studied, I basically never met a parent who wanted their child to be a professional chess player, soccer player, or dancer. So there's not a real professional outlet in any of these fields that's seen as highly desirable. Now, there are a few different reasons why we saw the growth over the past 100 years, societal reasons and structural reasons that we can think of. The first has to do with just American society, which has long been considered competitive, actually growing in the number of competitions and prizes offered. Used to be we just had the Academy Awards, then there's the Golden Globes, the SAG Awards now, et cetera, et cetera. There's also been a lot of changes in family life. Demographically, families are having fewer children, so the focus becomes more on the few children that you have, more time devoted to them. And then finally, what I've already talked about a little bit, but the higher stakes of education and changes in the educational system. So not only changes in terms of compulsory education, where high school became mandatory, but also changes in the increased importance of college. And that's really the biggest change in the educational system that's trickling down and affecting our kids today, the college admissions game. Of course, we've heard so much about this lately. Lowest number of acceptances ever. Stanford University, 5% this year, et cetera, et cetera. The media knows how to get everybody worked up about this. But that US colleges and universities consider admissions categories other than academic merit, solely just your SAT score or your GPA, is rooted in history as well, and it's uniquely American. And I argue that this is part of the reason that these highly competitive and organized youth activities are more common here as well. So Jerome Carable, in a great book, but it could stop your door, it's a long book, so I'll give you the gist of it. It's called The Chosen. In that book, he shows how the quote-unquote big three of Harvard, Princeton, and Yale developed new admissions criteria in the 1920s to keep out undesirables, like Jews and immigrants. So basically, they offered one admissions test. Too many of those undesirable Jews and immigrants were let in, so they developed a system that favored the quote-unquote all-around man, who was naturally involved in clubs and athletics. And what this also led to was the rise of the alumni admissions interview, so that you could see the candidate in person, know what they looked like, assess them in that particular way. So popular press coverage, as I just mentioned, of the recent low college acceptance rates, lower than ever at elite universities like the Big Three, only fuels parents' anxiety, reinforcing the competitive culture. Now, this is also partly because of the 15-year-long rise in the number of high school graduates, which just recently peaked at 2.9 million, although it varies in different parts of the country. People are having fewer kids, but they just had a lot of them at the same time, and that made it harder to get into college. But it's also not just that there are more students today. It's also that more of them are applying to particular schools, and technology makes this easier. From plane travel to the Common Application. The Common Application has really changed a lot of this if any of you have been through the college admissions process recently. So to help gain an advantage in the college admissions process, children are encouraged to distinguish themselves both inside and outside the classroom. Participation in competitive activities is particularly appealing because these proving grounds look like recreation. Now, many Americans prefer to shroud the honing process in activities that can be and generally are experienced as fun, but it's crucial to the American ethos of competition that it shouldn't look too much like work, especially for kids. But it's not enough to say you do something or that you are ambitious. You have to prove it to the colleges. So competitions provide a check on this and help prove how successful or involved you really are. Now, of course, this may be an imperfect measure, much like people say about the SAT, and of course, we've all heard recently about changes to the SAT. But it does measure something. And this is why the carving up of honor has become so important. So you can't just say, I'm an ambitious student or I love doing this, you have to prove it. And the way to prove that might be to say, I'm the national champion, or I was the national champion at age 14 in roller skating of kids that only practice 3 hours a week. I mean, that's how finely some of these awards for national champions are given out. And certainly that worked for one student who you may have heard of this year, Kwasi Aneen, who is accepted to all 8 Ivy League schools along with Duke and the SUNYs, striking terror in the heart of all these parents who want their child to be the ultimate overachiever. According to USA Today, he plays the violin, he sings in his school's a cappella group. Of course, there was no word on his ranking in violin or the number of wins in his singing group, or if he was accepted into that Stanford 5% class. But certainly, that's a new goal for a lot of parents, even if it's a completely misguided one. Okay, at the same time, it would be a mistake to think that parents fixate on college admissions offices every Saturday out on the soccer field with their 8-year-old, or at least I hope that's true for many of you. Instead, you should understand the grooming of your child as producing a certain kind of character and a track record of success in the more proximate tournaments of sports or dance or chess. But were parents to think in directly instrumental terms about that thick admissions envelope, which some do, they wouldn't be far off the mark. Activity participation, particularly athletics, but also school newspaper for the savvier parents out there, a national survey found that editors of school newspapers got into better colleges, in case you were wondering, does confer an admissions advantage, either through athletic scholarships or an admissions boost, giving students an edge when applying to elite schools. Now, why is that? There's 2 reasons here. The first is that many schools, small schools, let's take Amherst for example, they field all of the teams at their school. So about half of a class, half of the student body is on some sort of sports team. So you just have to have people who can play some of those sports, and that's going to give you a little bit of a boost. Now, I'm sure that most of you here know that the goal of getting an NCAA scholarship is, for most people, a complete pipe dream. Forget about that 5% admissions rate to Stanford or Harvard's 5.9 admissions rate. Getting any sort of NCAA scholarship, the chances are less than 2%. And that scholarship's often only about $11,000. A full ride, the chances of getting that on any given, the chances of getting a full ride in any given year are less than 1%. So most people aren't doing that for the money, or if you are, you need to rethink that strategy. So again, the odds are better to get into Harvard than to get an NCAA scholarship in any sport. But the other thing that sports can do is signal that you could potentially pay full tuition in an era of needs-blind admission. Sociologist, an education scholar at Stanford by the name of Mitchell Stevens did a study that he sat in on the admissions committee, all the meetings at an elite liberal arts school and at a needs-blind financial aid school. And if you were a student who played lacrosse, or perhaps crew, or squash, or field hockey, or fencing, well, that was basically code for your family could pay full tuition. So I don't want to give advice about college admissions, but you could take that away. If there's nothing else you take away tonight, that could be something that could help you with that particular long-term goal. Okay, but really what we're talking about here is more than an ability to pay when it comes to social class. And social class is a big part of the story here. Children can develop skills through participation in these competitive activities that will serve them throughout life and potentially help establish them as members of the ruling class. So I call this competitive kid capital. And these 5 skills and lessons that are associated with competitive kid capital are associated with the competitive aspect of the activities, not just recreational participation. Of course, kids can learn many things from just participating recreationally in an activity like teamwork, the importance of practice, sticking with something, etc. But what I'm saying is that there's something unique gained by competitive participation. So I'm going to begin with internalizing the importance of winning. And this is a main goal of competitive kid capital. So I'm going to weave in a bit of the research from Playing to Win just to give you a sense and to give you some colorful quotes. For those of you who haven't yet read the book, of course. So here's one quote from a parent who I met. I think it's important for him to understand that being competitive is not going to just apply here. It's going to apply for the rest of his life. It's going to apply when he keeps growing up and he's playing sports, when he's competing for school admissions, for a job, for the next whatever. Competitive children's activities reinforce winning, often at the expense of anything else, by awarding trophies and other prizes. The focus is really on who wins the biggest trophy and the most important title, no matter how small the carving up of honor is. Now, I had no idea trophies themselves would be so prominent when I began this research, but it became a shorthand way of explaining to people what I studied. I'd say, oh, I study things where kids win trophies. So trophies enabled the kids to know the feeling of being competitive, though this was often only true for them for their first participation trophy, and then they just wanted the biggest trophy possible. So linked to learning the importance of victory is learning from a loss to win in the future. This skill involves perseverance and focus. The emphasis is on how to bounce back from a loss to win the next time. And in popular parenting parlance, this is called grit or resiliency. So one mom told me, "The winning and losing is phenomenal. I wish it was something that I learned, because life is really bumpy. You're not going to win all the time, and you have to be able to reach inside and come back. Come back and start fresh," and they are able to. I'm not saying he doesn't cry once in a while, but it's really such a fantastic skill. So because competitive activities belong to organizations that keep records, the stakes are higher than in recreational leagues, and children can see that it matters that there's a record of success. So just for example, with chess, the United States Chess Federation, you could go online, search anyone you know who might have ever played in a chess tournament, totally public, enter their name on the website, you can see all of their results. On top of that, every 3 months, the United States Chess Federation publishes what are called the top 100 lists, which is all the top 100 8-year-old players, 9-year-old players, 10-year-old players, and then they separate out girls, they do a separate girls list as well. So you get a sense of how much it matters that you are doing this in a public way and everyone knows when you've experienced a loss. So these competitive activities in childhood also help kids learn how to recover from those public failures and how to apply themselves and work hard in order to be long-term winners. You can really only learn the identity of being a winner through a loss. This father summarizes the sentiment, trying to raise a son to be a winner in life. This is what I'm trying to get him to see, that he's not going to always win. And then from a competitive point of view, with him it's like I want him to see that life is, in certain circumstances, about winning and losing. Do you want to be a winner or do you want to be a loser? You want to be a winner. There's a certain lifestyle that you have to lead to be a winner, and it requires this, 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 and this. And if you do this, this, and this, more than likely you'll have a successful outcome. So learning how to succeed given time limits is a critical skill as well, one of the this things you have to do to be a winner in life, according to the parents I met. There are time limits for games, tournaments, and routines, and the competition schedule is also demanding, cramming many events into a weekend or short week. On top of that, children need to learn how to manage their own schedules. One boy, to give you a sense of the kid interviews, in an unintentionally funny and prescient comment about how busy his young life is and how busy his schedule will likely be as an adult, told me that he thinks soccer helps him learn about, quote, dodging everything. Like when we have to catch a train and there are only a few more minutes, we have to run and dodge everyone. So soccer teaches that. Parents often link learning how to perform under time constraints to future challenges such as the SAT, which I'll come back to in a minute, or to working as busy consultants and CEOs managing intense and complicated schedules. Children also learn how to perform and compete in environments that require adaptation. These environments may be louder, more distracting, colder, hotter, larger, or smaller than anticipated in preparations, but competitors, and especially winners, learn how to adapt. The adaptation requires focus on the part of children to focus only on their performance and eventual success. The following quote by a chess mom links this to the previous point about the SAT. It's that ability to keep your concentration focused while there's stuff going on around you. As you go into older age groups where people are coming in and out of the room, the ability to maintain that concentration, a connection with what's going on the board in front of you, and still be functional in a room of people, it's a big thing. I mean, to see those large tournaments in the convention centers, I know it's hard. I did that to take the bar exam and the LSAT I took for law school and GREs. You do that in a large setting. But some people are thrown by that, just by being in such a setting. Well, that's a skill, and it's an ability to transfer that skill. It's not just a chess skill, it's a coping with your environment skill. So note that this mom is even thinking beyond college with her son still in 4th grade. Finally, in this pressure-filled competitive environment, children's performances are judged and assessed in a very public setting by strangers. This dance mom explains, I think it definitely teaches you awareness of your body and gives you a definite different stance and confidence that you wouldn't have. For example, you're told to stand a certain way in ballet, which definitely helps down the road. When she has to go to a job interview, she's going to stand up straight because she's got ballet training. She's not going to hunch, and she's going to have her chin up and have a more confident appearance. The fact that it is not easy to get up on stage and perform in front of hundreds or thousands of people, strangers, and to know that you're being judged besides, definitely gives you a level of self-confidence that can be taken to other areas. So again, if she has to be judged by a teacher or when she's applying for a job, she'll have more of that confidence. I always have to stand up straight when I read that quote. On top of this, children are ranked both in relation to others' performance in a particular competition and in relation to participants their age. These appraisals are public and again often face-to-face, as opposed to those standardized tests that we talk about so much, which actually take place anonymously and privately. So for example, at dance competitions, if anyone watches Dance Moms, yeah, okay. So you know that you go to a competition, they don't always show this in the awards, but everyone leaves with something. You get a silver or a gold or a platinum award, and then there's a comparison, which is the set standard, and then there's a comparison only to the people who are at that particular competition. And of course, Dance Moms is a good example of the internal evaluations that are constantly going on, which don't happen for most people. If you haven't seen the show, they put a pyramid up of where everyone ranks each week and who's at the top and who's on the bottom. And most people don't actually function that way, but they're making explicit a process that actually happens all the time in these competitive environments, that there's someone on top and someone on the bottom, and is just laying it bare for everyone. Now, of course, some of these quotes and skills and lessons are tending to emphasize positive things. You might disagree with some of them. Some people think we don't want to just raise kids who want to feel like winners. But there are, of course, negatives that we can think of to participating in some of these competitive activities as well. So here's my Carol Dweck comment. Lack of intrinsic motivation. Carol Dweck on May 9th, come to the other talk to hear more about this. But we can think about this also as trophy culture and everyone's a winner. There was actually a great study, which was not by Carol Dweck, about intrinsic motivation that's particularly relevant here, which was some researchers went into, I think it was a kindergarten classroom, might have been preschool, and they asked the kids to draw a picture. And some of those kids loved to draw. Half of them got a certificate for drawing the picture. Half of them didn't. The researchers came back a few weeks later, asked the kids to draw. The kids who'd gotten a certificate, even the kids who loved to draw, said, well, what am I going to get for drawing the picture? So giving those trophies and awards, even something as small as a piece of paper, can really change how we relate to what we're doing. Another point here that we hear all the time is that parents are living through their kids. I mean, to me, this is a bit of a straw man. I'm a parent myself, even before I was a parent. I guess I take a generous view of humanity, but there are very few parents, I've never met one who says, I really want to mess my kid up, or, I don't want what's best for my child, I want what's best for me. So are there some parents who are living through their kids? Perhaps. That could be because they had a great experience and had a great childhood and are happy with how they turned out as adults, or perhaps they wish that they had done something different. Jean-Benet Ramsey is held up as, the mom living through her daughter. She had competed in Miss America. She felt she started too late, so she got Jean-Benet started younger. We hear this all the time with football dads, kids starting younger than ever to fulfill their dad's ambition, that sort of thing. This doesn't quite hold the weight with me. I think people, again, are operating from a place of what is best for my child and how can I best help them. But this could lead to self-esteem issues and worry about disappointing the parent, and on a related note, having an identity that's too wrapped up in one activity. And this can matter in a few different ways. What if you end up not being great, or what if you end up having an injury, you can no longer play on that soccer team or on that volleyball team. And not only are you losing the identity that you had for yourself, and we don't talk about this a lot, but the kids are also losing their social network. And that can be especially difficult during adolescence to feel like you've lost your group. So it's often good to have another outlet as well. And then there's also a big issue here about questioning your talent and, more importantly, your intelligence. And I saw this a lot with chess. That kid, it was okay with soccer. Maybe you're never going to be the fastest. That's okay. Or with dance, you're not the most flexible, or you don't have the best pirouettes. But kids in particular spoke to me. With chess, what if I'm just not smart enough? And even at that age, they had the sense that, yeah, it's great to be a sports star, but your brain is what stays with you through life. And what if you're just not smart enough? And so that you can see whether it's chess or a spelling bee or after-school math enrichment, but that's something to be very careful about as well. And then also, we have this issue of overscheduled kids. And we could even think of this as we're worried our kids can no longer be bored. And I had this great quote from a dad who said, "I'm concerned because in our desire to give them a well-rounded education and provide for them, what if we are just taking something away from them? What if the child needs to go out to the backyard and just do nothing, kick the dirt, stuff that we did as children, have some imaginary play where he or she is the only actor just on her own or something like that? I don't see Lena doing that. I'm not sure what can be done, but I do think about it. For example, she told me that in the car she gets bored. There's all this business of being bored. It's the catchphrase. Everything is boring. When she's not in one of those activities, she's bored. So I told her, Lena, why don't you daydream when you're in the car? This is my concern, because I think you will end up wasting your time some other time in your life if you don't waste it now." So even this dad who's, deeply ambivalent about participating is just worried his daughter's going to waste time later on in life. And of course, iPads have completely changed this. If you let your kids, heard it's, no screen week around here, but you all know if you have an iPad or a phone, it's much more difficult to be bored, and what else does that take away from kids? But of course, there's still the focus on that future. Waste your time now so you don't waste it when you're my age or something. Now, of course, again, getting back to this overscheduled issue, theories abound that kids are overscheduled these days, that they're going to grow up to be lazy because of these over-involved helicopter moms who are ultimately creating neurotic slackers. But despite those theories, we actually have very little evidence that participation in these activities is harmful, or that parents are even pulling back when it comes to exposing their elementary school age kids to competition run by adults. So we've had the free-range parenting, the idle parent, all of that, but there's no real evidence that numbers in these activities are declining. In fact, they're increasing. In addition to that, psychological research shows that kids who are engaged in activities are less likely to show depressive symptoms and report higher levels of overall well-being. Now, that's not necessarily competitive activities, but that's activities themselves. Of course, the social scientist in me knows that there's a bit of a selection effect here. Kids from families that have the resources to be involved in these activities are less likely to show depressive symptoms and those sorts of things. But it should reassure you that kids are resilient, and in fact, they do like to be busy, as the not being bored comment indicates. So how can you make this work for you? How can you keep your sanity and respect your child's autonomy while preserving options for the future? Because that's a lot of what parenting is about, preparing your children for the future. Well, you've got to take into account a bunch of practical considerations. And those practical considerations include access to resources, and that means time and money. So in the course of my research, I met one family that I would consider the only truly upper-class family that I met. Actually have 5 kids. All 5 of the kids did 2 travel sports, and all 5 of the kids did a language class on the weekends. So they were a white, waspy family, but their kids either went to Arabic school or Chinese school on the weekends because they thought that was important for them. Well, they had 5 kids, but 2 parents, and they had lived in Asia, and they had a live-in nanny couple who was married, a man and a woman, who they brought back to the US with them. So that's 4 adults for 5 kids. But every weekend they hired a 5th adult, a driver, to drive the other child. So that family had access to a lot of resources. And despite the fact that the North Shore is known for great resources, most people don't have access to 3 people who can be hired to drive their kids around to other classes. So we have a finite time limit to our time and money, and so that's going to be a serious consideration, and especially when there are siblings involved. So when you are juggling more than one child, choices have to be made. You have very little control over when things are scheduled, so there's that practical consideration. Now, a lot of people ask me, what happens to those siblings? Do they resent the other child? Are the younger kids dragged along? Is the younger child wanting to do the activity more because they see the older sibling do it? And the answer is all of the above. I saw every permutation of this play out. There's not a one-size-fit-all model, and it just depends what the activity is and truly your child's personality. So you really need to think about your child or your children and what works for them. And so you want to think about those personality traits. Do they have that killer instinct? Some people have it innately. Some people it has to be sort of nurtured or pushed a little bit along or respected in some other way. Now, of course, you could choose not to pursue or develop any sort of competitive instinct in your child, but going back to those issues at the beginning, quantifying this ambition, the carving up of honor, this is part of the long-term goal if you're interested in particular types of colleges and universities for your children. Some people won't be, and that's a valid choice as well. But if that's your goal, these are the sorts of things you need to think about. And it's very helpful, actually, at this young age to create, if your child is not into competition, you can have them fail potentially in an environment where it doesn't really matter. When you're 8 years old, as I mentioned, out on that soccer field, if you don't make that goal, that does not mean you're not going to play soccer at Harvard when you're 18. More than likely, you're not going to. But you're not going to have to get into that situation where you're 17 and playing in the state, championship game, and you have to do that final kick, and you crash under the pressure because you've never been in that environment before, or you can't cope with the loss. And so when you're 8, it doesn't really matter what happens. So let's develop those skills when kids are young, make them resilient, make them able to cope with these lessons, because whether or not you want to go to Harvard or whether or not you want to play any sport at a more competitive level or anything, all of us have probably been in this situation where we didn't get the romantic partner we want. We didn't get the job that we want. We didn't get into that school that we wanted. So we face these competitive pressures all the time, and it's, do we have those resources to come back and deal with it internally and try again? So doing things when the stakes aren't as high can be a good thing. And then, of course, in terms of talking to your child and thinking about your own child, you also want to think about different options. So would your child be better off in an individual activity or in a team activity? A lot of kids said to me, particularly with dance, which I studied in particular because it was mainly girls, and there was an opportunity to distinguish yourself both as an individual but to be part of a group. And a lot of girls with one of the studios I worked with, getting a solo at a competition was seen as a very prestigious thing, and there wasn't a lot of jealousy, and I was quite shocked by this. But they would say, oh, I know that her turns are better than mine. Or I know I wouldn't do as good of a job and no one could cover up for me, and I like being part of the group. So in fact, often the children were saying things that might not have gone along with the competitive kid capital that their parents quite wanted them to develop, but they were tweaking it to make it work for them. Other things you can think about is the type of activity. So actually the reason why it's chess, dance, and soccer and playing to win is that chess was the academic activity, dance was the artistic, and soccer was the athletic. So you can think in terms of your child, what's going to work best for them? What's their personality trait? I was saying my 2-year-old son earlier tonight, well, he loves music. Unfortunately, he has no rhythm at all. If only enthusiasm for music could make up for it for him, but of course I'm going to put him in music class because he loves it. And who knows what will develop. Maybe, hopefully, someday he'll develop some rhythm. We'll see. There are specific strategies, though, that we can think about to develop healthy, competitive kids. The first is this great phrase that goes back a long way, little Renaissance men, but a mother of 2 young boys told me that she was a single mom, and she said she wanted to raise little Renaissance men. And she was from Australia, actually. And so to her, being a Renaissance man too is being able to go into any environment around the world and being able to fit in. And so to her, in her opinion, that meant being able to play chess, because you could go anywhere even if you didn't speak the same language as someone and play chess. Learning a foreign language was equally important. And the other thing that was important to her was skiing. She thought if you could ski, you could get along with people. That's, again, a very class notion, but this was the thinking: you could ski and fit in anywhere. But skiing came up again. There was another dad that I met who he himself had actually not been to college, but he had done very well in the financial sector. And his two daughters, he had one daughter in 3rd grade and one daughter in kindergarten at the time, and they were both fencing. And he said, we're fencing, but the problem is everyone has figured out now that fencing gets you into an Ivy League school, which is sort of true. But now there are so many people doing it, it's less true. So he said, I'm looking for the next thing that I can predict that's going to help my daughters. So he had decided that it wasn't skiing, that it was snowboarding, that all of those X Games activities were the next wave of the future. So his daughters were snowboarding. So this brings up this strategy of being a generalist versus being a specialist. Do you want to specialize early? Do you want to find one thing that you're the best at? Or do you want to be a generalist? And in terms of what has happened in college admissions, the pendulum tends to swing back and forth. But a more healthy way to think about it is that there's going to be a mix of both in any college class wherever you go. And what the college admissions officers are actually trying to do is create a well-rounded class. So sometimes there are going to be specialists, and then there are going to be those generalist students. But if you read the preface to Playing to Win, I talk about interviews that I did with elite admissions deans. And what they're actually looking for, and as I say, it was the first time that I really understood how I got into Harvard. You have this thing your whole life, you think, well, now they're going to finally figure out that they made the mistake. But it was the first time that I said, okay, now I get it. So she told me that they're looking for students who are really good at something. I mean, obviously you have to have the academic credentials, that goes without saying, but you have something that you're good at, and then you have something else. And they want to see that you have that something else. Because when you get to college, and it's funny that I have on my bio on the website, I discovered sociology, but that's actually true, and they want someone who's going to get on campus and say, wow, rugby, I've never played rugby before. Well, I was recruited for the swim team, but hey, they don't have those NCAA scholarships, so I'm going to go try and play rugby, and it doesn't matter, then I'm not going to swim. Or, wow, I'd never heard of anthropology before, and now I'm going to seek out this new thing that I've never done before. And because if you've developed that resiliency and you developed the skills to manage multiple things at the same time, and you can demonstrate that, that is going to help a lot in the college admissions process. And as a person, out there in the world, and we like to say, what is it? Every single parent who I interviewed, what do you want for your child? I want my child to be happy. Well, of course that's true. We want our children to be happy, but we also want other things for them. So how can we get to that point? And one of the really practical things that we can think about here is raising non-quitters. So, your child says, I want to try the violin, or I want to try rugby, or whatever it is. And we've all been in this situation. A few classes come, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to go to practice. So you want to develop those skills of, well, you made this commitment, and let's see that commitment through, and then see what happens. Now, of course, there's different thoughts on this out there. Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom, says, well, you've got to force your kids to keep with music lessons because no one likes to do something they're not very good at, and once they get that mastery, it's going to work better. Now, there are some studies that that's actually true for things like math. You want to challenge them, and it's really hard, and then once you get it, you like it even more. But again, this is a similar skill set to being able to say, oh, wow, I just discovered something new, and I want to try that now. And that ability to stick with it and be open to the exploration is something that we want as adults, and again, if you want to be practical, potentially for college admissions. But at a more, short-term strategy, one way to develop this in your kids is actually to pursue summer camps as different options. And some summer camps are probably full up already. As many of you, I guess most people have signed their kids up for camp already, right? Yeah. So, but this is one way to do it. There's like a week of learning pottery or a week of learning a new sport. And that's a very real strategy that you can pursue to help your kids and expose them to new things. So whether you're thinking about camps or classes, let's discuss some issues to address that can help you make those choices better. and what questions you should ask. So the first is you want to think about the training of your coach or your teacher who's working with your child, and that's true on 2 levels. You want to think about their training in their particular specialty. Are they really qualified as a music teacher? What is their background? Are they really qualified? Do they have those skills in whatever sport it is? And then you also want to ask, what is your background in working with children of this age? Do you have any training in education? It's very different to work with 12-year-old girls on a soccer team and 8-year-old boys competing. Very different issues that you're going to be dealing with. And it's great if someone has some actual educational training. You also want to look for, is the organization or the camp credentialed by a national organization? Let's take gymnastics. You should never send your child to a gym that's not affiliated with the United States Gymnastics Association because they go through certain safety trainings. Similarly, soccer is actually one of the best sports at training youth coaches, that there are levels of licensing that you can get. And so you want to ask that question as well. And why does this matter? Well, of course, for the safety record. Now, Jerry Sandusky, is really an outlier, but there are issues of sexual molestation. Still, this shocks people. Not every state has Corey checks mandated for working with kids in a lot of these activities. So that's just a basic safety thing. But then you also want to find out about the track record of physical injuries. Anyone could open up a dance studio. So do they have the proper floor that helps prevent knee injuries, foot injuries, that sort of thing? Often, again, there's not a legal requirement to disclose that, but you should ask, do you have insurance? Who's your insurance by? If an organization does not have the proper insurance, that's a major red flag, that probably they're not working within the right safety modifications and all of those sorts of things. So what I say to people is, you want to be a nudge at the beginning, and the teacher might think, or the coach might think, I don't want to deal with this parent, they're going to be terrible. But then if you're the nudge at the beginning, you get to completely back off and say, wow, I trust this person, I trust their expertise, and they're going to be able to teach my child, and my child's going to be able to be safe with them. And then you become the parent that the coaches love. You back off and let them do their job, and not email them or call them or go up to them after practice or class and try to tell them how to do their job. So bug them at the beginning, and then don't bug them, for a few months unless you really think there's a major issue going on. So overall, instead of thinking of childhood as a project, which makes it seem exhausting to us and like we don't have enough time, I prefer to think of childhood as a buffet. So as you know, as at a buffet, you can sample a lot of dishes, and then you can go back and get larger servings of your favorites. So I think we should approach children's after-school hours in the same way. Sample lots of different things and let the kids figure out their favorites and let them go back for seconds. So what parents choose to expose their kids to is ultimately shaped by a variety of individual and societal factors. For example, in certain parts of the country, ice hockey is popular. In other parts, it's Pop Warner football. So, and then on top of those regional preferences, parental background matters. More educated parents may shy away from activities they consider dangerous, like boxing, and instead push weekend math classes. And parents of boys and girls are going to tend to favor different sorts of activities as well, even within the same family. I didn't talk a lot about gender here, but it matters a great deal, especially for girls, so I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Now, of course, not all boys are going to grow up to be those little Renaissance men, and not all kids are destined to be well-rounded. While these are worthwhile goals, parents must also listen to their children. Based on my interaction with the Playing to Win kids, I know that children are an integral part of the process of choosing an activity. In some cases, kids will approach their parents with an activity that they'd like to try. Perhaps a girl saw the US gymnast win the gold in the Olympics. She wants to try gymnastics. If a child expresses interest in a particular activity, it's a good idea to explore a class in that or something very similar. Perhaps dance if you think cheerleading might be too dangerous. Or you have a aversion to cheerleading, you could try dance or gymnastics instead. When an activity is parent-driven and a child wants out, or even when a child requests more of a particular activity, even if they're not the best, some parents succumb to this, oh my goodness, my child's not the best, I have to find what they're the best at. But if your child really loves it, you should let them keep doing it. Parents need to listen to their children's desires, especially before investments of that time and money get too high. What's important really is that kids are exposed to a range of options when they're young so they can explore, be creative, and start to gain mastery. This helps ensure that kids will be intrinsically motivated and hopefully develop a genuine interest and passion in a given area. And it's that intrinsic interest and motivation that will stay with them through life and not really the specifics of serving a tennis ball or doing a pirouette. So I've come to think that there's real merit in exposing kids to competition at younger ages, especially so that they can learn how to deal with the victory gracefully and deal with the loss with resiliency when the stakes aren't very high. In the end, again, what happens on that soccer field when you're 8 won't determine your whole future, but the skills you develop by dealing with the missed penalty kick will stay with you throughout your life. Unfortunately, no magic number of activities or number of hours of participation exist that will guarantee your little one gets into an Ivy League school. In fact, some activities, like those National Honor Societies I mentioned at the beginning, might not matter in the way that we hope. I just want to read you a quick quote from the book, which is from the Dean of Admissions at Harvard, who says, we've inadvertently created these honor societies. We find them confusing because there's so many these days. Membership in multiple honor societies become like hollow participation trophies. As one educational expert said, once everyone's wearing rhinestones, you might not notice someone wearing diamonds. No equation can tell us whether or not our children will rebel later in life if they go to ballet instead of karate. But there is a way to keep childhood fun and full of creativity and exploration while still training kids for the next step in their lives. By allowing kids to explore within a structured set of choices, they'll be able to know what they really love as they move into middle school and high school when those specific choices start to matter more. It's a long march to get through all of today's credentials checkpoints. My own sons will surely start preparing for similar credentials checkpoints at a young age with doses of competition to build up their competitive kid capital. And they'll likely sample chess and even dance and soccer at the buffet spread laid out for them. Because the reality is that as long as winning remains important in American culture, playing to win will remain a central focus in many American childhoods. And if you can't read this quote at the bottom says, "Wolf, wolf, he cried for a third time, but this time no one came, and the wolf ate the sheep, and the shepherd boy never got into any of the really good schools." Thanks.